Okay, so first off, I grew up, I was born in New Jersey, and I grew up with my father going to the classic bookstores in the city, the Strand and Barnes and Noble, and we had a reverent, the house I grew up in had 30,000 books in it, and we had a reverence for books. So my dad would say, when you pick a book out of a shelf, you don't grab it by the spine, because if you do, you damage the spine. So that's the level of reverence I have for this place. And I walked in and I was like, it feels like home. So it's a pleasure to be here. And Danny also said he likes to mix science with art. And this is what I'm doing with the book. And I'm going to start by just telling you a story about garden gnomes as a way to loosen up the crowd here, and I'll crack this beer. So I have two children. They're now one's almost in college, one is in college. And the girl is 20 now. Her name is Willa. My son is Elias, 17. But when they were little, they had very different personalities. And Willa was a total ass kicker badass. So she, by age 11, was a black belt in Subak-do, and actually went and trained with the son of the founder of that art. And she played a musical instrument. What instrument does a badass play? The saxophone. And when we went to Washington, D.C., Willa ended up meeting Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA. So we've got this alpha female girl. And then we have Elias, who really was just kind of chilling out in his life. And the thing that he did primarily was he got obsessed with gnomes, garden gnomes. And he was, partly through my fault, he was convinced that they were alive, because I would write letters from the gnomes to Elias, and I will never admit to him that I was the guy. So he had this ongoing correspondence with gnomes, and he ended up collecting a lot of gnomes. And I have a friend who called me one day and said, I have a journalist friend, and she's wondering if you know anyone who has a weird hobby collecting strange things. And I said, yeah, I know a fella. And Elias was 8 at the time. And so this journalist for Parade magazine, which is circulation 20 million, it's in every newspaper in the country, calls and interviews Elias, who at the time was 8. And 6 weeks later, Parade magazine publishes a feature on weirdo collectors, and Elias is one of those people. 10 days later, so short story, he's internationally famous immediately. And Willa, who's done all this hard work, is looking at him like, all he did was collect garden gnomes. So 10 days later, we start receiving weird packages in the mail. So wrapped in paper, tied in twine, and inscribed in shaky hand from places like South Carolina, Eunice Edgman, South Carolina. And I've been in the environmental field for my whole life and pretty radical. And when you get a weird package, in my line of work, you're thinking anthrax or a bomb, or you're paranoid. So we very delicately opened the package, and it was a garden gnome. And dozens of garden gnomes started arriving at our house. And they would be accompanied by notes saying, I saw your article, and I've always loved gnomes myself, and I would love for you to have this. There was this incredible human connection where people would say, my husband died 10 years ago, and we ended up having correspondences with these people. And Elias did an aptitude test, or one of those things that says what your career is going to be in 6th grade. And not 1 on the list, but number 3 was airline cargo handling supervisor. So like he wasn't and my wife said, well, at least he's a supervisor. But the point is, Willa looked at him with this just fury. Like, I can't believe he's become so famous. And the point of the story, which is in the book, is that you all have a story like this that you could tell of your child, your friend, your partner, a crazy human experience. And these are stories of human thriving. They're stories about things we can do as people when we're not subject to floods and fire and drought and a survival society like Cormac McCarthy described in The Road, which is where we're headed as climate change progresses. And so the point of the book is to kind of square that circle between the things we love and what we're doing about it. And the problem it addresses is, if I sample a crowd and I say, what do you care about? And people will say, my community, my family, the natural world where I spend a lot of time. And then you ask the average American, what are you doing about it? And they say, I don't even vote. I might recycle some plastic, which doesn't get recycled. And so this gap, the point of the book is in part to close that gap, and it's also to get people to use their love of things as a motivation to do meaningful work on climate. And the challenge of this, survival society we're headed for is that all the things that make humans great and that allow us to progress are things of leisure, really. Like this bookstore is the thing, the poetry, the art, the music. Those are the things we do when we have a break and we can pause and we can start to think about what is a way to be a better person? How do we build a better society? How do we innovate and think differently and drive change? And if you're like, that's kind of liberal bullshit, all you have to do is look back in history and say, who did the people who didn't want progress and change to happen kill first? So Stalin and Mao and Hitler and Pol Pot, they killed the intellectuals, the writers, the poets, the people who take us to the next level. And there's this artist, Anthony Weiner, who has a great line, not Anthony Weiner, Anthony Weiner. Richard Weiner. Do you know this guy? I'm not going to talk about the guy who took the dick pic. Yeah, Lawrence Weiner, and he said he was an artist. He said, I don't want my art to screw up your day. I want it to screw up your whole life. And so the thesis of the book is, in order to thrive, we need to solve climate change. That can be a motivation. Okay, so I want to just tell you a little bit of how the book progresses and some of my answers, and then we'll just have a conversation. And if you want to interrupt me at any point, please feel free. So I was born in New Jersey in 1970. Danny's from Philly. In South Jersey, we consider that Philly, and the slogan was "Only the strong survive," which applies. And the reason that slogan came out of Jersey was Jersey in the 70s. Here's what was going on. You want to get a house and a mortgage? So 1970 to 1986, mortgages were like 18%. Inflation was insane. That's the thing we keep talking about. Oh, inflation like the 70s. Vietnam War was still going on and then ended catastrophically, and the nation was traumatized. We had urban blight, urban problems that we thought were irreconcilable. The South Bronx in New York was regularly on fire. And it was an awful time. And there was horrible pollution. I grew up in Weehawken, which is right outside the Lincoln Tunnel. I played baseball above the Lincoln Tunnel. There would be plumes of pollution, purple pollution, pouring up over the first base line. And we'd foul balls off into traffic. And people were like, I was like, isn't someone going to get killed by a baseball dropping 300 feet into their windshield? And, it was almost like, it's Jersey in the 70s. They'd be lucky to be taken out of their misery. So this was going on, and Environmental problems got so bad in the United States, you couldn't see the city. Rivers were on fire, the meadowlands were filled with garbage, that the American people and government acted. And they passed the two most important pieces of environmental law in the history of environmental law: the Clean Air Act, 1970, Clean Water Act, 1972. And I, in the summer, would go visit my grandparents in North Dakota. And I'd arrive in North Dakota and I'd say, what is this place? It's so beautiful. It's so pristine. The sunsets are pink. I asked my mom when I was 6, can I tell people I'm from North Dakota, not New Jersey? And I grew up thinking I hated New Jersey. And what I hated was America before environmental regulation. Because as I grew older, those two laws, which were amazing, cleaned up the United States. And rivers were clean and the air became clean. And at the time, the EPA, after those laws were passed, the EPA said, and think about the prescience of this, they said, we're about to do something amazing. So they hired a photographer, a team of photographers, and they sent them out into the United States to document how bad things were. And then 20 years later, they sent photographers out again. Think about the prescience and the vision to say, we're going to do something great today, and they knew they were going to do it, and they did it. And you can Google U.S. before the Clean Air Act, and online there are these stunning pictures of what happened. And so I have this theory that was great for society, but it was also draconian environmental legislation, and the business community said, never again. Never again should we experience that level of regulation. And that sentiment dovetailed with a neoliberal free market ethic that had been coursing through American society since the 1940s. So do you have Naomi Oreskes' book, The Big Myth, here? Have you run across that?
It sounds familiar.
Okay, so The Big Myth is, it's that thick. It came out a year ago. I forced myself to read it. It's about the growth of neoliberalism, which is just basically government is bad. People associate it with Reagan. Government's not the answer. It's the problem. And basically the idea that there should be very little regulation and we can solve these problems on the free market. And this was the world I came into as a 20-something arriving at Rocky Mountain Institute to study with Amory Lovins, to work with Amory Lovins. And the thesis was that business can solve the climate problem because it's cheap to save energy. And if we change all the light bulbs in this room, it'll save us money. It'll reduce heating costs because they use less energy and produce less heat. And we'll want to do it. We're motivated by profit. And so I heard that and I was like, this is awesome. I love it. And I was all in. And the way to think about this, the thesis, it was so sexy, was you're basically replacing energy and resources, oil, coal, electricity, and material with thought. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of that. In a skyscraper, a lot of the energy is to pump water. So if you put in a waterless urinal to save water, you save water, but you also save pumping energy. And then you make more money to the bottom line of your business, and it's awesome. And so this is the stuff of like TED Talks, like the next thing I'm going to do. Another example would be you typically go to a Starbucks and you get a cup of coffee and then you pour the cream in and you take a stirrer that's made out of either wood from a forest or petrochemical that was shipped to you on a diesel truck, and then you stir it once or twice and you throw it in the trash. And what would corporate sustainability do about that problem? They'd fix it using design. Gavin, this is your design solution. They would say, put the cream in first, pour the coffee in, no stir. And those are the ideas that really got me excited. And I came in to work at Aspen Skiing Company when Jeff in the back of the room was there, super excited to put this theory into practice. And in short order, I realized that it was very difficult to do even the most basic sustainability measures. So I went to the 5-star hotel and I said, we're going to change all the light bulbs. It's going to save you 40% and you'll have a return on investment. And Schuster's one of the people I was working with or fighting with at the time. And the manager of the hotel said, no, we're not going to do that. And I said, what are you talking about? I was told that no smart business person would turn down a 50%, 70% return on investment. And he said, Auden, I can sell a bottle of wine for $25,000. If I've got an extra 10 grand, I'm not changing light bulbs. And that was the beginning. That was only one barrier. There were all these other barriers that no one told me about. One barrier was, I don't believe the bulbs will save energy. No one told me that belief would be a barrier to the corporate sustainability fix. So I started to realize that my first kind of dip into cynicism was, it's not enough. We got to do this stuff, but we need to do something else. And I continued to work, and I just could not get stuff done. And when I did, it was so token, it didn't matter. And so I then had a kind of depth further into cynicism and jadedness. I thought, you know what, actually, this is a way to avoid the hard work, because business wants to appear to be green, but not actually do the difficult work of changing the world. Because when you do things that are disruptive and change the world, you get in trouble and people get mad at you. And as I proceeded, I thought, actually, so it's not enough, it's not a distraction, it's a dodge. And then one day I was riding my bike during lunch and this word popped into my head, complicity. And I thought, I want to do a thought experiment. I'm going to make a list of all the things a sustainable business person does. You measure your carbon footprint. You take blame for the problem of fossil fuels and climate. You set targets for reductions. You write sustainability reports. You buy fraudulent carbon offsets to address it. And I thought, okay, that's the general list of things. If I were the fossil fuel industry and I wanted these very powerful entities that are corporations that have followings, think of Apple's customers that love Apple, that you have a following and you have power and you have influence in Washington and you have voice. But what if we wanted to completely neuter them? What would we do? And the answer was the same exact list I just laid out. So corporate sustainability as practiced was complicit with the fossil fuel industry. It was the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. And we were never going to change that. We were never going to get out of that situation. So we said, we got to think differently, we got to think bigger, and we got to change systems in a big way. And I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples of how we thought about that, but then we'll have a more of a conversation. First, though, one of the ways the fossil fuel industry gets you to believe that you can't say anything, and you've all heard this. You say, I care about climate change. And the person in the room says, how do you heat your house? You say, oh, natural gas. They say, you like that? Yeah, I like it. How do you get to work? I drive my car. What does a car run on? Fossil fuels. Oh, but you don't like climate change, do you? But you use this stuff, and in the ski industry, of course, we greedily used all this stuff. And this is a way to neuter you, because who's powerful in America? Who's powerful in the world? Citizens. And citizens do revolution, but not you if you say you're guilty too. So here's the answer to that problem, to that confrontation. Basically, Americans, I'll use Americans, but it's society at large. Americans say in the early 1900s, we didn't say, hey, will you provide me with mobility, hot showers, cold beer, warm house? Provide that in a way that will eventually destroy civilization, if you would, please. That's what I'm looking for. We didn't say that. We said, let me have that as affordably as possible. So the fossil fuel industry was amazing. If you think about it, basically we were digging around in the dirt and we found this rock that happened to be flammable, and it powered all of the Industrial Revolution, coal. And then natural gas and oil were similar. We dug them out of the ground. They were free. They're amazing for society. They brought people out of poverty. Refrigeration ended health issues. They kept us warm. They allowed us to live longer. And the problem was that around 1950, scientists became quite clear that CO2 was a problem. And it was warming the atmosphere. It was basic physics. And there's one scenario whereby a society would have said, oh my gosh, we got a CO2 problem. Science says it. Let's change policy, but let's not rush into it. Let's take 50 years. No, let's take 70 years and slowly innovate and invest in technology and get off fossil fuels, but not in a way that hurts jobs, not in a way that damages civilization. We're going to do this over time. Of course, that's not what happened. In 1977, ExxonMobil knew exactly what was happening with CO2. They predicted the amount of warming we see today in 1977. So even then, we could have said, we're going to do this change. But instead, ExxonMobil, and this is all well documented in the public record, they said, I don't really want to do that. I would rather monetize their now $33 trillion worth of proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground. I'd rather monetize those, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to hide the science, literally bury it in archives. We're going to participate in groups that inject disinformation into society, which is why a lot of people still don't believe climate science. And we're going to buy politicians, because you can do that in the United States. And they did it, and they won. So the second half of the book is about how do you fix that problem? And how do you get around, how do you make change at a systems level instead of a token level? Because all of us say, well, I recycle and I drive my electric car, and that's my answer on climate. And corporations have done that as well. They take token actions that are voluntary, but they don't change systems. So here's an example of how we approach that. I'm in my office one day, and I'm calculating our carbon footprint. At this point in my career, we'd changed all our light bulbs, we'd built green buildings, we'd changed boilers, we'd insulated buildings, we'd put in new windows, and I did the carbon math, and our carbon footprint was going up. And I was like, what the hell's going on here? I was told that if you do this, your emissions will go down and you'll save money. So I dug in, I couldn't figure it out. And then I finally realized that the utility which was all coal powered, had got even more coal powered. So they went from like 96% coal to 98% coal in that year. And so our carbon footprint went up. And I had an epiphany. Oh my God, it's not about us. It's about the utility. We got to change the utility. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, what is a utility? How is it governed? Who runs it? How do you change it? I didn't know anything about it. So I started poking around. Turns out we were part of a utility called Holy Cross Energy, which powers up till about Rifle, east of here. And it's governed by a board of members. And any member can run for the board. So I started calling people. Hey, would you run for the board of the rural electric co-op? And people would say, why would I do that? It sounds like the most boring job in the history of planet Earth. And I'd say, it is. It's probably the most boring thing you could possibly do, but it's really important for the climate. And that's how it went. We kept calling people, couldn't find anyone. There was one dude on the board who was a coal supporter we had to take out, and we literally needed to find a breather, someone who would fog a mirror to take that spot. And I found a woman who was much more than that, who ran a greenhouse in Newcastle. Her name was Lynn Dwyer, and I convinced her to join the board. She ran, and she won. Why did she win? She was the first woman to be elected to the Holy Cross board in its entire history. And that gives you a sense of what we're dealing with. So 1947 on, no elected women to the board. So you run a woman, and it's like, what could go wrong? You know, if we put a woman on the board every 75 years or whatever, it's worth trying it. And so she wins. And then we run another election, and we lose. And then we run another. And eventually it became like shooting fish in a barrel, because we were up against these crusty ranchers who'd been on the board for 40 years and never had to face an election. And we would use technology known as email to counter these people. We'd have an email campaign, and then we'd run ads in the paper and have letters to the editor that used the term environment, which they never used. And so we won all the seats. And holy crap, but it took 10 years. And it was super difficult. It was so controversial in the community. I was attacked. I couldn't go to their meetings anymore because I was scared. And at midway through this battle, and Jeff, I don't know if you know this happened in the company, I was told I could not speak for the company anymore in the Holy Cross battle. And so I was no longer was Aspen Skiing Company fighting this fight. It was just me. And so I continued. We eventually took over the board. The board achieved, today is 90% clean energy, real clean energy, with a 100% goal by 2030. And their CEO is a climate scientist. The previous CEO, who actually was a wonderful guy, was a weightlifter. So the metaphor is weightlifter to climate scientist. That was a transition over time. And later, I had a new boss at Aspen Skiing Company, and she said to me, you know, the best stuff we ever did at this company was the Holy Cross campaign. That was the way to do stuff. And I was like, yeah, that was good, wasn't it? She didn't know that we weren't even allowed to talk about it. So the book has I'm just going to use that as one example of systemic change versus the kind of tokenism you see corporations involved with. And I can give other examples, but I won't. I want to end here with some thoughts about how you take on a problem of the nature of climate change. And because the thing that you don't hear in the literature is that we've sort of failed in this fight. We've seen about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. This is the amount of warming that the Paris agreements say is the difference between manageable warming and catastrophe. And we're headed toward, by end of century, we're headed toward about 3.3 Celsius warming, which that is not good. That produces a kind of Mad Max society where you have problems with droughts and floods and fires, all the things you're already beginning to see at only 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so it's very discouraging to take this on. And as a writer, you know, there's a lot of pressure to be positive. In fact, there's a rival climate book to mine that says, what if we figure it out? I think the title is, what if we do it? That's a lie. We're not going to do it. We've already failed, and this is a different thing. And the thing is still hopeful and optimistic, and I'm going to explain how. I have a friend who's a climate modeler who's from Asheville. He was at Climate Week in New York, and he came home after posting, you know, on Facebook and Instagram, hey, I'm in Climate Week, we're doing it. He comes home to Asheville, which is destroyed. And I called him, and I said, Drew, we're failing on this, and we're not going to be able to figure this out. And I got no response, because at the time he was taking buckets of water from the river to flush people's toilets. And 10 days later, he called me, and he's a very aggro guy, and he's on the phone. He says, Auden, we're making things better. That's what we're doing. We're making things better. We're not solving. And I think the way to think about climate change is to abandon this notion, this very American notion of winning and losing. I'm a winner. And this gross kind of like, and you heard it originally with George W. Bush. He's a winner. I'm a winner. Trump talks about being a winner, and you're a loser. And that's the problem, is that in society, if they're winners, they're losers. And we've always tried to be on the side of the losers in a progressive society. And with climate change, no generation has been presented with the opportunity to actually save civilization. That's what we're talking about. It's this profound shot at the greatest thing any human has ever done. So the act of solving climate change is the chance, this one chance we have that's universal to endow our lives with some of the oldest ideas and aspirations that humans have ever had. So think about basic tenets of all religion, treating your neighbor as you would like to be treated, or the idea of leading a dignified life, or a graceful life, or treating people with tolerance. And so my thesis ultimately in the book is we can't help but do this. We're being presented with this incredible, awesome opportunity to live lives of meaning, and we're not going to be able to turn that down. It's going to be hard, but that's part of the deal. That's what we do as human beings, is hard, difficult tasks. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you for tolerating my rant. But let's see if you have questions or thoughts or observations or criticisms or anything. Yeah, Tim.
So you talk a lot about things that aren't being done the right way, or things that are in fact a farce in place of the real thing. In my view, part of the issue with the climate argument and where it's turned people away is that it's always presented as this dire circumstance and we're all screwed and there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas, as you noted at the end of the talk here, what is actually going to motivate people is to talk about solutions. So, and inspiration, and provide that kind of light of the fire. So where do you think the change in the conversation is going to happen, and how should it start? Because I think that is a big thing that turns people away from taking action or from believing in science or whatever you want to blame it on, is that they don't want to be perceived as like the radical, when it doesn't have to be the radical thing. It just needs to be the thing. So where does this conversation shift from we're screwed to
right?
we're on
Well,
the right path?
I think the problem has been that to answer your question, people are provided with a token response, which is drive your electric car and declare victory, and instead of a comprehensive response. And what I'm saying is the comprehensive response involves citizenship and acting as a member of society where you care about other people. And those things are difficult, but they're rewarding. And so the ask of people is don't stop with that individual action, but that proceed to citizenship. And that means engaging in the political system, talking to your neighbors, coming to events like this, talking to elected officials, being part of movements, giving money to charities, running for the Planning and Zoning Board, running for town council, changing your local codes, running for Congress, being a citizen. The famous line from Ben Franklin's life is he's leaving the Constitutional Convention. A woman says to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he says, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And we have uniformly failed to keep our republic. We've forgotten what it means to be a citizen in the United States. And you know, one of the points I hammer in the book is doing difficult and almost impossible things is in our nature. Cormac McCarthy, one of my favorite writers, he says, "All things of grace and beauty, such that one holds them to one's heart, have a common provenance in pain." And Reinhold Niebuhr says, "Nothing of any importance will be achieved in your lifetime." And you hear that as a human, you're like, it's hard and it's going to take forever. I don't want to do that. But your response should be, yeah, that's what we do. We fight these battles. So what are the impossible battles we uniformly fight? We're mortal. We're all fighting that. And then if you think about the stories we tell ourselves over and over again, John Steinbeck said, we only have one story and we tell it over and over again. What are the stories we really like? They're about fights against persistent and recurring evil that we ultimately lose. Let me just suggest a few for your consideration. The Bible, The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Beowulf, one of the great old stories, Beowulf. Any of these you could go in deep on, but Tolkien said that this is about an evil you don't defeat, and that was tied to his Christian faith. Remember, Frodo and Sam get back to the Shire, and it's destroyed. They didn't win. They had to rebuild again. And in Beowulf, the great hero, at the end dies and leaves his people unprotected. So these are the stories we tell ourselves. It's what it means to be human, and it's an incredible opportunity. I don't know if I've sold the American public with that, but that's the thesis of the book. What other thoughts or questions do people have?
Maybe just to kind of build on what you just said, you're familiar with E.O. Wilson, and in one of his last books, I think it was called The Meaning of Life.
Yeah, that was incredible.
Pretty much summed up the meaning of life is the stories we tell.
Mm-hmm.
Here at Lithic Bookstore, we're working on the stories that people think about.
Yeah.
And we all know what we're doing most of the time. You know, and this is, I think this is related to so much of what you're talking about, our technology, and how we have this powerful technology, and it's going to take a while for us primates to learn how to use it more wisely.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've had, all of our, 10,000 years of civilizational development, and then within 10 years, this radical change comes in and arguably begins to destroy society. This is the perfect place. You have the perfect books here to think about these questions, because you got Noam Chomsky up there. Chomsky's argued that power systems want people to be distracted. So autocrats love football fans, because if you're really into the Broncos and obsessively into that, you're not paying attention to what's happening in government. That's the value of social media, which is absurd and an incredible waste of time. And you also have some Tim Snyder, who's a Yale professor who writes on tyranny and fascism. And if you think about solving climate, it's about democracy. And our democracy is in dire shape. And your store is trying to answer the question, what do you do when you're seeing this collapse of functional democracy, encroaching autocracy? What are you supposed to do? And the answer in part is, one thing is this, is to convene, to talk to other people, to have conversation, to be a decision-making body to some extent, to educate yourself, and to lose the phone a little bit. And I think it's hard to overrate the destructiveness of social media. I mean, any of you who've been on, if you go on Instagram, you're instantly sad. And the reason is that other people are showing you how great their lives are. And we know their lives aren't that great, because everyone has a hard, difficult time. They have great loves, and they have great losses, and they have struggle and injury and sickness and death. You can only learn that in this context, but you can't see it if it's a curated thing on the phone where you only show good stuff. What other thoughts do? Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what to do about things that I see that are evidently wrong. And okay, one big example is the egg cartons. What was wrong with the paper ones? They were working so well. Why do we have the plastic? I mean, and who do you tell? I just don't want to buy the plastic ones. But how can you make a difference and see people or see somebody, that can probably make a change there?
Right. Okay, so, and this is part of what I talk about in the book, which is there's an element of the egg carton concern that is there to distract you. And it's there to distract you because if you're focused on the egg carton, you're missing the system that created the egg carton. And the way to think about it, I think, is in the early years of the kind of Toyota management revolution, the engineers would ask what they called the 5 whys. They'd have a problem and they'd say, well, why is that happening? Well, why is the plastic egg carton plastic? Well, because it's lighter. Well, why is that? Because we're transporting it. Well, why is that? And you get to the root of the problem. The problem with the egg carton is that we live in a society that has never costed out pollution. It's free to pollute. And using fossil fuels is incredibly affordable. So the fix would be a good, robust carbon tax. Well, how do you get to that? You got to have functional democracy. So the fix isn't, I'm going to fight for a carbon tax. The fix is, how do we make sure we don't lose our democracy? I mean, we're at this point where we've slid back from I can work on climate to I have to work on governance so that we can get to climate policy. So it's citizenship. And when you tell this to people, this is a pervasive thing in small communities. I live in Basalt. I ran for town council because no one would run. I was like, who are these old farts? They got term limited, then they ran for mayor, and now they're running again. And I was like, someone should do this. And no one stepped up. And so I did it. And the reason, Sarah, you may run into this, the reason people don't do it is that they think there's some magic information that elected officials have. Like that they're special and they have this knowledge and they, trust me, we are the bottom of the barrel. Like town council, it was literally, I didn't know anything and nobody else knew anything. And that was what America was set up to do, to allow citizens to govern. So there's this barrier, like the secret language of government keeps people out. And someone like you asking this question, it's like, yeah, you and others should be more participatory in society like that. And when you do it, it's hard, but it's also pretty cool. So this is the difficult trench work that, another theme is if you're up on a stage, a fancy stage, with a thin lavalier mic giving a talk, like a TED Talk, you're probably not changing anything. But if you're in a room where several people are pretty mad at you and you're like little drops of sweat are coming down your neck and it's difficult and you don't sleep that well, which I never do, you're probably making a difference. And so that's sort of the barometer of meaningful versus token work. What? Yeah.
In this room, just looking around, I see a lot of living that's been done.
Oh, harsh.
And I think that one of the things that concerns me, whether it be the environmental movement or many other causes I participated in my life, is getting young people involved. What are your ideas about that? Is writing one of the ways that you're reaching out, or is it speaking? What has the most impact?
Yeah. So
on the younger generation? Because just my point of view, but what happened in this last election, I think all of us are realizing young folks had a lot of input in that, and I would like to see some changes in that regard.
Yeah, had a lot of input? Are you, seriously? They did, and they also didn't show up. So there, some showed up and others. So when I...
maybe misinterpreted.
Right. When I was pitching my book to the publisher, they said, oh, this is good. We need to reach young people. Because it has been, in the climate fight and other areas, you haven't engaged young people. Generally speaking, younger people do care about things. If you look at the polling, they don't want to just buy a thing. They want it to be affiliated with a good cause. And so yeah, my book is very intentionally focused on being fun and hip and relevant and reaching younger people and bringing them into democracy and arguing that, there's fun to be had in that world. But you're right. I mean, this is of a piece with the question of how do you keep your democracy? How do you engage younger people? And if you look at these town councils, they're all like ancient. And they're all stuck in their ways, and they're all governed by a certain, if you want to win an election in a small town, you say, I like small town character, and you win. But what that means is not doing anything. And the things these communities like Basalt need to do is they need to put housing, dense housing, near mass transit, and that's going to change the character of the community. But you're doing it to protect the community from gridlock traffic and other problems. So yeah, this is a big problem. We have the youngest town councilwoman in the history of Basalt is now, came from my office and is on the Basalt Town Council. But we definitely need that. And part of what I've thought about is like one of the failures we have is we don't have, if you think about the Lions and Rotary and the Elks, if you're young and you go to a Rotary meeting, you're like, what the hell's going on here? Did I walk into 1940? It's like, hey, does anyone have some happy bucks? And then I went to one after saying the pledge, which has its own fraught stuff around it. They sang, take me out to the ball game. I was like, what? What is going on here? So then I sit through that and they're like, would you like to be a Rotarian? And I was like, no way. But how do we rebuild those things in society? Let me give you a quick example because there's some members of this society in the room. When I was midway through having kids, and they were little, so I was only dealing with kids, I woke up one day and I thought, what if I got horribly injured? Who would help me? Who in my community would help me? I don't see anyone. I'm just head down, doing my job, dealing with my kids. I don't have close connections. And I said, and at the same time I was reading the Harvard Happiness Study. Are you all familiar with that? It tracked people for 75 years and it said, why did they live long? Why did they thrive or why did they die? And the answer was social connection. So I said, I'm going to start a men's drinking and vice society and Gavin was one of the people I invited. And we're going to go to a bar every 8 weeks for 2 hours from 6 to 8 with no agenda. We're going to drink beer and whiskey and talk about whatever we want. And we did it. And the interesting thing was we live in a busy world. And I thought, people won't be able to make it. People are busy. You got the basketball practice. I'd call people and they'd be like, when is it? I'm going to be there. And literally, we always had good turnout. And one time we were in the bar, the Brick Pony in Basalt, and I'm hanging out with this group. And some guy, he comes over and he says, I know what you're doing. And I was like, what do you think I'm doing? And he said, this is an Algonquin round table. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it was when Groucho Marx used to meet with, who was it? Margaret Mead and some other people in the Algonquin Hotel. And he said, and I want to be part of it. Well, he was a realtor and I didn't even know him, but he got what was going on and he wanted it. And that's part of what we have to do. And we're doing it here, but we have to get more people. And so my idea was beer, bring in a younger audience. Maybe there's that opportunity, but we have to start thinking more in that community realm. And that thing I did was motivated out of self-interest, which was I'm losing my connection to the community. Was there another question over there?
Well, I just wanted to say something about that. Auden, you probably don't know this, but when so I'm an outdoor industry business owner in the Valley, and 5 years ago, Tim Foster, who was the president of the CMU at the time, came to me and said, I want you to start a degree program in the outdoor industry. We have all these businesses. We need to feed these businesses with a skilled and talented workforce. So I called a bunch of people in the outdoor industry. I had no idea how to start an academic program at a university level. I called Auden, he was on my list, and asked everybody, what do you need? What do we need in this program? And so I got a bunch of advice and started the program. And of course, in my foundations class, I had a conservation and stewardship week, and I asked you to come and speak to the class. We launched the program in fall of 2020. So the program was over Zoom, right? At the time,
Right.
You were speaking over Zoom, and your lecture was about how these things we are doing, recycling, riding our bikes to school, turning off the water when we brush our teeth, are really good things. We should do those things because we're good people on the planet, and that's what good people do. They care about the planet. But what we really should be doing is getting involved, and the most important thing we should be doing is voting. And that sort of piece of curriculum, it's so funny because I just graded final exams on this class last night, and now we have 150 students in the program. So that is a question on the exam. What is the most important thing you can do as a human being on planet Earth to fight climate?
Yeah.
And the answer is to vote and to be a citizen.
Right.
And it just is really interesting that they come in with no hope, because we've delivered them this planet with no solutions and no, and like, oh, it's done. It's
Right.
a done deal. We're not going to solve it.
Yeah.
But they feel hope when they have this piece. And so I just wanted to say, like, this message has carried forward with these students. And I think we just need to continue to say these things to these kids that are 17 and 18 and 19 and 20 and 21.
Right. Right. And Sarah, to your credit, like, that's a tool of the fix, the work you're doing. This bookstore is a tool of the fix. But I worry that people say, vote, and then it's done. That's the problem. Yeah, I voted, but it's not done. The citizenship piece, the problem with it is it's not a thing I can tell you to do, or anyone can tell you. It's not a thing that's obvious. It requires getting into the men's vice, or women. We sometimes include women. Well, actually, no. And sitting and asking the question, where can I wield power, my unique power? Where can I drive change? And it's difficult. And so in the book, we get into these things that if you looked at them in retrospect, we look like geniuses. But with Holy Cross Energy, we didn't know what we were doing. We're trying stuff. This matters, I'm going to push on it. This other issue matters, I'm going to think about it, talk about it, and try to drive change. I might get on the planning and zoning board because we can change building codes. And it requires agency and creativity and mobility and kind of motivation and hustle. And it's hard often for people to receive that message. It's like, I don't have the answer for you, but you got to think about it and work at it, and you got to fail, and you got to get up and keep trying. Anything else? Yeah.
Question. So, of all the organizations that are about Skeeko's size in America, there's probably a handful of people like you that are trying to do what you're doing, that are running into not as friendly of a board or of a executive suite. And I'm curious what you say to those people, because I imagine you've had those conversations. So what is the message that you deliver to somebody?
Yeah. Well, there's different strategies to deal with that. There's, exit, you can leave, you can use voice, you can stay loyal and work from the inside. And I say, look, you should be trying to drive change and do it in a copacetic way where you're saying, seems like it would make sense for us to be involved in government affairs, not just changing light bulbs. And so you try, but then at some point, I don't believe in change from within that much. I haven't seen it work that effectively. So I say, there are jobs out there where you can be more effective. And maybe you need to rethink that. Because it's been, a lot of people in my field get very discouraged because they're just put in a box, which is measure the carbon, do the operational thing, and they know it's not driving change. But I will say, there are a bunch of apostates in my field. When I started, I was the only guy, and I was like, come on. Now I have this kind of cadre of men and women in academia and business who are the radicals. And we call it the grouchy men's and women's club. This is a separate club that I'm involved with. Drinking does happen, but it's not exclusively drinking. And there's power in that group. And I think one way to think about change and revolution is we think we've got to have everybody. And that's never been the case. The Enlightenment was 200 people that changed the world forever and brought us the science that's in this room and the sense of the world and medicine. And the social science says you need 5 to 9% of the population. Think about this. We did the most technologically difficult thing in the history of humankind when we landed on the moon. At that time, 60% of Americans didn't believe in evolution. That number is about the same today. So you don't need everyone. You need a few good men and women. And that's part of it, is being part of that coalition to keep people chugging along. Yeah.
So, living here in Mesa County, which is, I'll call it fairly right wing, they resonate to drill, baby, drill. You know, and you're talking about trying to do stuff locally, and obviously, I think there's a difference in opinion in the younger community and stuff like that. How in the hell do we try to affect change, in this kind of environment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one problem has been we have not approached that community as if they were dignified people who were good people doing good things, and they are. And again, there's a chapter in my book that's called Talking About Climate Change at the Rotary Club. And it starts with the spiel I gave, which is there's nothing wrong with the fossil fuel industry, but it makes sense to transition. So starting that conversation, and then, it's not going forward, it's not going to be a great business to be in, but there are great jobs to be had using the skill sets from that industry. So we have to rebuild transmission lines, for example. And we have to, and that's actually high paid work, instead of saying, oh, stop fracking and put in solar panels. And so instead of going from, 90 grand a year, you can make $12 an hour. Like, that's insulting to say that. So I think it's meeting people on common ground. I think the problem that I'm encountering is we've almost tipped back into people who don't even believe that that there's a problem with climate, which someone called. I get a lot of irate calls and emails, and this guy basically was denying that climate change was an issue at all. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not even gonna have a conversation about that. We can move on to how do we solve this problem. But there's almost a level of backsliding on that. But I do think that there's an element of human dignity in this that we haven't had, and conversation and gathering and reaching out and appearing in the other person's turf. I'm going to end with this just note we learned from an ad campaign we did, which was, we felt if we were going to do something on climate, that the presidential election was what most mattered. But if we took a position on it, would it be helpful as a ski resort, as a conglomerate of hotels and resorts? Because we could take it and just take a position and just get horribly polarized. And so we did some research. We talked to the Yale program on climate communications, and they said the real problem Trump voters have, or right-wing voters have, they don't want to be looked down on and disparaged. They want to be treated as citizens and people with agency. So our campaign said, if your mind's made up on the presidential election, God bless you. We recognize you as a citizen with agency and decision-making authority. But if you're on the fence, consider climate. Campaign didn't work, clearly. But that's the kind of, that's the kind of dynamic we're having in society, where we look down on them, they look down on us, and there's a human dignity we've been missing. I know it's easy to say this, it's harder to put it into practice, but a hopeful thing is that if you look at the tenets of major religions, they're kind of progressive. You know, there's nothing really wrong with the teachings of Jesus. He said you should love your neighbor, give all your money away. There's a great piece of writing Bill McKibben wrote in 2006, I think, for Harper's. It says, "How a Faithful Nation Gets Jesus Wrong." And he lays all the stuff that Jesus said, and you could choose major tenets of Judaism or Islam, and we don't follow any of it. Like, you know, and so the hopeful thing is we spent thousands of years figuring out how to live as human beings. We wrote it down in religion. Those ideas are all good. So there's some core of us that wants to do this thing where we can talk to our neighbors and take care of each other and so forth. So I'm going to stop, but I'm going to be here and we can chat. Couple quick notes. One is this time in history is difficult, and if you read some of the books in this room, whether it's Chomsky or Tim Snyder or James Baldwin, you know that historically we're in a weird time. There's some odd stuff happening in government, whatever your politics are. Some of the things we're seeing in the appointments to major offices are direct aspects of fascism, where you're putting loyalists in, but you're also putting in buffoons, and you're putting in buffoons because you want to denigrate those institutions. And so what do you do in this time? And how do you fight back? And one answer is this kind of bookstore is an essential. This is like Woody Guthrie said, this guitar fights fascism. Well, this bookstore does that. And so buy a book, my book preferably. I will sign it. No, I really think you'll enjoy it. But buy a book, buy a t-shirt, support these things as you're doing. Keep coming back. This institution cannot fail. And it's been here 10 years. It should be here another 100 years, but it depends on society, civil society, to make it possible. So thank you for what you've done. And thank you all for coming here on a Friday the 13th to listen. So much appreciated. I'm here. I'll sign your books. I'll chat more. And then a bunch of us, Jeff, are going to a bar after this.
Whatever's still open.
Okay. Thank you.